Let's start by defining the key concepts of our subject. The concept of race classifies people according to their naturally occurring physical features like skin color and to their historical roots. It's a social construct. Gender refers to differences between men and women that are not biological but are socially constructed. Race and gender are two variables that interact together and with others, and their conjoint study to understand social phenomena is called intersectionality. Race and gender will be the prisms through which we will analyze the American criminal justice system, that is, the system of law enforcement that is directly involved in apprehending, prosecuting, defending, sentencing, and punishing those who are suspected or convicted of criminal offenses. For the purpose of our research, we have chosen to focus on sentencing to make a sufficiently detailed analysis.
From 1619 to 1865, the harshest criminal penalties were for acts that threatened the institution of slavery. These laws, referred to as slave codes, were established due to white fear of slave uprisings and were used as a way to restrict black slave life. Slaves who tried to run away or start rebellions were killed, and white people who helped slaves in any way suffered severe punishment. In fact, slaves convicted of murder were publicly hanged, beheaded, and mutilated as a deterrent to other slaves. Slave punishments were determined by degree of blackness, which is based on the amount of black ancestry a slave has. For example, some slave codes reduced or eliminated punishment for slaves who had a white mother. Race was the most important factor for determining punishments under the slave codes, but gender and socioeconomic status of the offender and victim played a role as well. As shown from the chart, crimes committed by a white offender are given little to no punishment compared to crimes committed by a black slave offender. For example, a white person assaulting another white person is 1 to 10 years in prison, but a black slave assaulting a white person can result in death. Almost all of these offenses are punishable by death for a black slave offender, all but the murder of a fellow black person.
The 13th Amendment guaranteed black people certain rights, like the right to marriage and the right to enter contracts, but these rights were undermined by things like vagrancy laws, which were used to arrest black people who were unemployed or homeless. Quote, Southern justice in the form of KKK lynchings resulted in the deaths of thousands of black people. Black people were also still given harsher sentences and even executed for crimes where white people were convicted of the same crime would get little to no prison time. For example, in United States vs. Cruikshank, more than 300 members of the KKK murdered 2 black men and 97 Klansmen were indicted, but only 3 were found guilty of conspiracy to murder, not murder. Black codes were eventually replaced with Jim Crow laws, but the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act effectively eliminated them, but other forms of racism still persisted.
As we can see from the diagram from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, blacks are more likely to be incarcerated than any other race, followed by Latino men and then white men. They found that black males are more likely to be incarcerated and receive longer sentences, and black males have a somewhat higher offense severity score on average, as well as lengthy prior records. In the article written by Stevensmeyer, Ulmer, and Kramer, they highlighted the intersection between 3 categories, which are race, gender, and age. With regards to race, the researchers found that black males were more likely to receive more severe sanctions, and more particularly young black males were found to receive the harshest sentences, but this influence of race diminished with increasing age. The researchers also found that the persistent residential segregations were also linked to the continued belief that blacks were more prone to criminal activity. They also mentioned that some research has suggested that to some extent, some judges share these beliefs and can be influenced by them in their sentencing. Overall, the influence of age on sentence severity is contingent on the defendant's gender and to a lesser extent, the race. Young middle-aged black males received harsher sentences because of the perceived notion that they would be most likely to engage in recidivism or are more likely to commit harsher, more severe crimes. The researchers finished with a quote stating, in addition to the strong effects of prior record and offense seriousness, offenders who are male, black, and younger in the age range of 20s to 30s are sentenced more harshly than defendants who are female, white, and middle-aged or elderly, and thus they are the group at a greater risk of receiving the harshest penalty for these reasons.
Being both a man and an African American or Hispanic results in sentences that are usually harsh and lengthy. But then, what about women? According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the probability of a US resident born in 2001 to go to prison at least once in his or her life is higher for men than for women. But when you look at the race of these women, you find that being a white woman is much more than twice as advantageous as being a Hispanic woman, and almost 6 times more advantageous than being a black woman. Study about gender differences in criminal sentencing, Fernando Rodriguez, Theodore Curry, and Gang Lee found out that the effect of gender on sentencing does vary by crime type. For both property and drug offending, females are less likely to be sentenced to prison and also receive shorter sentences if they are sentenced to prison. For violent offending, however, females are no less likely than males to receive prison time, but for those who do, females receive substantially shorter sentences than males. The provided explanation for this gender effect is the selective chivalry. Women are stereotyped as weak and childlike, and therefore not fully responsible for their criminal behavior, except when their crimes are too violent and violate gender's expectations.
In their 2001 study, sociologists Daryl Steffensmeyer and Chester Britt showed that black and white judges weighted case and offender information in similar ways when making punishment decisions, although black judges were more likely to incarcerate defendants and hence are more punitive in their sentencing decisions. Because they are overwhelmingly outnumbered by white judges, and because their differentness is highly visible, black judges as tokens may feel they are always under scrutiny and must perform well. Thus, they may put in an extra effort and take greater notice of would-be criticisms from constituents or their courtroom actors about the consequences of their sentencing decisions. They also may be particularly aware and concerned about the social and personal costs of serious crimes and drug-related crimes, especially within black communities.
Additionally, according to a Duke University-led study, the racial composition of the jury pool has a lot to do with whether someone is convicted or not. When the jury pool includes at least one black person, the conviction rates are nearly identical between blacks, 71%, and whites, 73%. Otherwise, convicted people are more often black, 81%, than white, 66%. In short, racial diversity in the jury results in fairer rulings.
The case reached a level of national conversation in which many argued that Zimmerman had targeted Martin solely because he was black. A long lawsuit followed, but ultimately George Zimmerman was found not guilty of second-degree murder and manslaughter, despite evidence that he suggested that he followed Trayvon Martin. In the court of public opinion, however, Americans are still clearly conflicted. On the one hand, Zimmerman receives an outpouring of financial support from individuals wanting to help with his defense, but on the other hand, hundreds of thousands have marched or shown solidarity with the Martin family, but wearing hoodies on specified days. Martin's story is an example of why we are still talking about race and why race is still a big factor in society. Although most black men that wear hoodies, similar to most white men, are not criminals or untrustworthy, they are easily and sometimes unconsciously suspected and criminalized.
Historically speaking, during slavery, crimes against white victims were regarded as more serious than crimes against a black victim. For example, the rape of a white victim was punishable by death for both white and black offenders, but the raping of a black person was not considered a crime if it was done by a white offender. Furthermore, there were gender disparities in punishments. When a white man and black slave had sexual relations, the white man had to do public penance at church, and the black slave woman was tied to a whipping post and beaten. But what about nowadays? When looking at the multiple affairs in which black people were murdered by whites who had not been subjected to a heavy sentence, it seems that being a black victim benefits the criminal when he is white. On February 26, 2012, Trayvon Martin was shot dead by George Zimmerman, perceived as phenotypically white. The law in the United States allows individuals to defend themselves by using deadly force if they feel their lives are in danger, and it is especially the case in the states where the Stand Your Ground law has been passed. Zimmerman claimed he felt his life was in danger when he had no choice but to shoot Martin, because the teenage boy wore a hoodie and was walking in the streets at night, which was suspect behavior from his point of view.
To address these inequalities in treatment between men and women and between whites and non-whites, we have made several recommendations. However, these recommendations can only work together and not individually. The first set of solutions is about the role of judges. First of all, reducing their level of discretion at a federal level would limit their power of discrimination when sentencing. Secondly, creating commissions of inquiry to assess the influence on race on judges' decisions would help identify the least objective judges.
Since the days of slavery, racial inequalities have existed and persisted via many forms of discrimination, including the use of unjust justice. As we have seen, race and gender play a crucial role in the sentencing process. The typical profile of the offender receiving the largest sentence is a black man. Women benefit from a little more leniency depending on the violence of their crime and their skin color. The darker the offender's skin, the harder the sentence. For example, Hispanics and Indian Americans are less disadvantaged than blacks, but more so than whites, no matter the gender. Let's switch to the discussion questions.